that work? So, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks, Ariam, for the introduction, and for the Tucson Botanical Garden for organizing this event in such a beautiful venue. Is this good?
Yes,
Ariam?
thank you.
So, my talk is titled Monsoon Stories from the Sky Islands. And what I mean by monsoon stories, actually, these are stories about second chances. So I'm going to take a quick poll first. Who in the audience is from Arizona? Who in the audience lived in Arizona for at least 1 year? Who in the audience visited the tree ring lab? Come and visit us. We are open to the public, and we are very happy to share the passion we have for trees, for the stories they hold. So, stories about second chances. The reason I asked who spent at least a year in Arizona was like taking a poll about how do you feel about this winter. All right. So, this photograph is from February 22nd. It was a Friday. I took this photo, fourth level in the ENR building, if you visited campus. So having snow in the desert is always beautiful. It's surprising. But I guess if you lived for a few years, this is not the first time you experienced the desert. So I am originally from Algeria. I grew up in another desert, in the Sahara Desert. And I remember when I was about 6 or 7, it snowed, and it was such an exciting event that we were authorized to not go to classes, and we played all day. So an event like that in the Sahara Desert, was very surprising. It didn't snow since then. It's been more than 2 decades. But in the Sonoran Desert, while it's beautiful, right, it is not uncommon, particularly if you look at the mountains. Often you can see them dusted in snow. So this photograph is from Mount Bigelow. Maybe some of you will recognize the road that leads to Mount Bigelow. It's one of our active research sites. And when you look at the snow, and when you think about this very wet winter that we have been experiencing, we think about the snow as being this very important source of moisture. And more than just an important source of moisture, it provides, during the spring, a slow and steady flow of water that most of the trees that exist in the Sonoran Desert at mid or high elevation will use when they start growing. So these trees, Ponderosa pine, dock fir, are set up to use that moisture. But while 2019 has been very wet, and we've seen a lot of snow, that was not the case of 2018, and I don't know how many of you remember that last winter was dramatically dry. And I remember, at least in our lab, and most of us studying trees, thinking, this has been a really dry winter. I wonder how trees will do when the growing season starts in April. So 2018 has been dramatic, and if you think about trees high up in the mountain, not having access to that source of water when they start growing is a period of stress that they might experience not only in April when they start growing, but as the season progresses and the temperatures get warmer and warmer. But, unlike the Saharan Desert, in the Sonoran Desert, there is a second pulse of moisture. This is a photograph showing a storm during the North American monsoon season, which happens here around July. So if you have a failed winter, these ecosystems, these forests or trees high up in the mountain, will have a second chance to access to moisture provided by the rain during the monsoon season. The North American monsoon is a very iconic feature of the Sonoran Desert. In fact, the biodiversity that makes the Sonoran Desert so special is related to this pulse of water. And this is a persistent weather system. It's been here for a while, and it provides in Mexico, where the core of the monsoon is, but also in much of the arid southwest deserts, a large proportion of rain. This map represents the four corners, and you can see in these heat colors, green and blue, and I'm going to explain them more in details, the proportion of rain precipitation. Precisely July, August, and September, how much that proportion makes the total rain received during the year. And you can see immediately these blue colors in the southern part of Arizona, where Tucson is, and also New Mexico. And this proportion is up to 60 to 70%. So it is an important source of moisture to this arid area. And I talk about the persistence. This weather system has been part of the ecological, natural ecosystem in the Southwest for thousands of years. Actually, about 6,000 years ago, the intensity of the monsoon, or the proportion of rain provided during the season, reached all the way up to the states, northern Utah and northern Colorado. And it's an anticipated event. Who is very excited or waiting for the monsoon to happen? All of us. Spectacular sunsets, you know, it breathes life again in the ecosystems. It is, you know, anticipated, like I mentioned, early July. These data come from Tucson, and you can see this is the average starting date per decade. And you can see it often arrives around the 1st, 2nd, 6th of July. The earliest monsoon recorded in the historical record, dating back to the 50s, I think was June 25th, and the latest occurrence of the monsoon was July 25th. So why is it anticipated as much by humans or by the different, you know, living organism or the ecosystem? It is anticipated in early July because the timing is crucial. So if you spent a year in Arizona or in Tucson, you know, this is a really beautiful winter, and then the temperatures start warming up. A lot of people leave Tucson at that period of time. And then it gets, you know, warmer and drier by May and June. And then the monsoon kicks in early July. And this is the relief, you know, to the different plants and forests up in the mountains, and also to the water demand. So this timing is very crucial in terms of bringing a second pulse of moisture. So when we think about moisture availability or moisture source in the Southwest, we always think about the winter. And the winter moisture has this characteristic, is because in the form of snowpack, this is what will recharge the soil and the reservoirs. And the fate of the monsoon received less attention in the future, particularly when we think about climate change. In this figure, I'm representing here the temperature anomalies plotted against time from 1880 to present. And the temperatures have been warming. You know, this is driven by the rise in the greenhouse gases, mainly the carbon dioxide. And you can see with increase in carbon dioxide, temperatures are warming. And when scientists use numerical simulation to project what the climate will look like by 2050 or the end of the 21st century, one of the major projections for the Southwest region is a drying up of the region, mainly because the precipitation during the winter will be reduced. So if that's the case, we still have the monsoon, right, as a second pulse. But what will happen to this monsoon also under the scenario of climate change? A lot of research has been going on, a lot of progress has been made in the recent decades to look at the fate of the monsoon. I mean, who lived in this region is very complex, the geography is complex, the topography is complex, the monsoon precipitation is complex. Sometimes it rains in my neighborhood and it's not raining in another neighborhood, right, in the Tucson area. But we're able now to project how this monsoon will evolve by the end of the 21st century. One of the projections about the evolution of the North American monsoon is it will get drier by the end of the 21st century. We're going to see a reduction up to 40% in precipitation received from July to September. The other projection is the timing of the monsoon. Now, as I've explained earlier, it's anticipated in early July. Often it's around 5th, give or take 10 days. But by the end of the 21st century, the monsoon onset will shift to later, by September. And what is drastic about this projection is when the monsoon starts later, and because it's going to be drier, it's not going to compensate for that delay in the onset of the start. So you can imagine the consequences of a shift in timing, particularly for agriculture or water demand or planning for that. So, to have an idea or a sense what it might look like in the future, a drier monsoon, a failed monsoon, or later monsoon, we can look back into the past and see if such a thing happened. This will provide us almost like a natural experiment to see how different ecosystems responded to a dry monsoon. I'll give you a hint, because I'm in the treeing lab, we look at this in the trees. So, we extract information from trees, particularly from their rings. So you can imagine a tree standing in an environment, experiencing changes in every year of moisture, whether in the spring or in the summer, for many decades, for hundreds of years, for thousands of years. We can go and extract that information using an increment borer. This is the device of choice of a dendrochronologist. So I'm gonna show you how we do it. This is called an extractor. The diameter of this bit is about 5 millimeters, so it's like a pencil. You can see me in that photograph extracting a tree core. Put this in a tree, manually drill all the way inside using the extractor, extract a tree core, and just like that, not just looking at it like that, you can have the history of that tree. I'm gonna pass around a few tree cores. You can have a sense of what it looks like. Yeah, you can pass it. Right here. These tree cores are from Ponderosa pine, from the Catalina Mountains and the Sacramento Mountains in New Mexico. So by extracting tree cores, we're able to look at the information recorded in each tree, but we're interested in the region, history. So we're going to collect multiple cores, 20, 50, 100 trees will be sampled. And by doing so, we can look at how the trees or the forest collectively experience variation interannually, decades, 100 years. Moisture variation, of course, in the southwest, but if you're looking at trees more in the north, there will be a temperature signal, for example. So two of the main species we study in the southwest are Ponderosa pine and dog fir. And if you look at the cores I've shown, and actually I can go back to this photograph, you can see that these rings represent 1 year worth of growth. And one of the fantastic things about trees is you can date them to the year, and by looking how the width of a ring changed, narrow or wide, you can have an information about what the climate was. But in the in the conifer species, particularly Ponderosa pine and dog fir, there is another level of detail that we can look at. These these are two photographs zooming into some of the cores that I shared with you, and you can see that one year, does this work on the screen? So you can see that throughout the year, there is an alternation of a light color and a dark color. This light color wood corresponds to the wood that is formed during the spring. The darker one is the wood that is formed during the summer. And like that, we can actually access to seasonal information, how the moisture changed between the spring and the summer. And you can see that these dark bands or these light color bands are not the same. This is the same tree. And you can see, for example, there is a very wide dark band which corresponds to a wet summer. Look at this light, colored or spring. This corresponds to a very wet winter that during the spring trees had access to. In this, dark band here, which is very narrow, this light band corresponds to a drier winter. You can see that in some years, for example, where we had a very wet summer, this tree experienced a dry summer. So some of my colleagues in the tree ring lab did a massive undertaking to reconstruct the monsoon in the past using Dockfir and Ponderosa pine. They sampled 53 sites. They took between 50 and 100 trees per site and averaged a total of 1 million tree rings. These were sampled mostly in Arizona and western New Mexico to look back in time how the monsoon changed. What they did, they looked at how wide these dark bands were and how wide the light bands were. So they can do, back in time, two reconstruction, one for the monsoon and one for the winter. And they were able to go back 500 years back in time. I'm gonna share with you some of these results. So, in this figure, you can see a reconstruction dating back to 1530. The year, the outermost year was 2008. And this is a precipitation index. Basically, positive numbers are wet and negative numbers are dry. Green is wet and this brown is dry. And what you can see is dramatic variations of the monsoon. This is a monsoon and the months corresponds to June, July, and August. So there is a dramatic variation, right? So we can see in the past, there are periods or years which were dry during the summer. But beyond, the dramatic variability, what you can see, there are periods of time where the drought in the monsoon lasted several years. In other words, the monsoon persistently failed. Then when we combine this with how the precipitation changed during the winter, we can start looking at the interplay between seasonal moisture impacted different ecosystems. So we have the monsoon on the top and the cool season from October to April. This is the moisture that the trees will access when they start growing in April. And one of the first droughts that we can observe both in the summer and in the winter is at the turn of the 20th century. This drought started in 1882 until 1905. During these 24 years of droughts, 19 years were characterized by a failed monsoon. And this, in combination with a dry winter, constituted a major drought event that had a social, environmental impact. Because of this drought-induced failure in rangelands, between 50 to 75% of the cattle perished in Arizona. The second dual, I would say, season drought that we observe in this record is in the 17th century. It is known as the Puebloan drought. From 1666 to 1676, this period was characterized by 6 years where the monsoon failed and 7 years where the winter precipitation was below. And this combination of a dry spell in both seasons is thought, or actually it's not, it's implicated in the Pueblo revolt that occurred in 1680. That was the breaking point. Some of you attended the talk that my colleague gave last week about how climate can put additional pressure and influence civilization. The third event that we look into this record is the 16th century mega drought. During 11 years in this period, the monsoon failed, and this drought was widespread and had like a very severe consequence on the landscape. Mainly, it has a pervasive effect on tree species and tree growth. So you can see that in cases in the past where the rain failed during the winter and failed also during the summer, a combination of both led to dramatic landscape change or social upheaval. One of the major consequences when you think about droughts, and I'm pretty sure a lot of you experienced this in the landscape here in Arizona, is tree mortality. This photograph represents tree mortality in New Mexico following the drought of 2002. This was a new type of drought or a new level of extreme that the Southwest region is experiencing. You know, the last drought in the 1950s was superseded by the one they showed you earlier in the 16th century, but this is a whole new level. You can imagine these massive landscapes completely changed by tree mortality. So one of the important questions that we ask, where we're able to go back in time and see what failure in the monsoon did, what we're interested in knowing is from the tree perspective, how trees are responding to the stress in the moisture availability or lack thereof. If there is a failed winter and then the monsoon occurs, how trees are taking advantage of that, how they are relying on that source of water. If both failed, how do they cope with sustained droughts? And we do this by looking at the ecosystem that we have here in the Sky Islands. This is a photograph in Mount Bigelow. This is one of our active research sites. And we're studying mainly Ponderosa pine by looking at tree rings again. And I would like you to look at this photograph for a few seconds here. And this is, again, 1 year of growth. And compared to what I've shown you earlier, do you notice any difference between this tree core of Ponderosa pine from Mount Bigelow compared to the tree cores I showed you earlier? I'm hearing yes.
No white.
All right, so what is it? I hear middle stripe. What else? There is a narrower trend. Any other guess? The middle stripe.
Okay.
So, the light, during this spring growth, there is this darker band that resembles the dark band that we see in the summer. And what is interesting, you see it's a persistent feature, right? Sometimes it's very pronounced, like in 2012, and 13, and 14. In 2009, we have trained eye, that you can see a faint band here. So there is a persistent feature in the Sky Islands, particularly at mid-elevation. So why does this middle band or this narrow ring that we call a false ring? You would think that this is the end of the growing season, but no, there is a whole other growth period that follows that. And this is simply a strategy that the trees, this elevation, have. When they start growing in the spring, using the soil moisture that accumulated during the winter, in May and June, particularly throughout June, the climate is very dry. The soil moisture that was available early in the growing season is getting less and less, it's more depleted going into June. So what the trees do in the face of of this dry period, they slow down their growth. They almost go in dormancy. And then the monsoon arrives. They wake up and they start growing during the monsoon all the way to the end of the growing season, which here lasts at least in Mount Bigelow up to November. So when looking at how trees do respond to this moisture throughout the growing season, there is one quantity that we're interested in. We don't look at only the precipitation or the soil moisture. We look at this quantity that is called vapor pressure deficits, or referred to as VPD. And what VPD is simply the atmospheric demand for water. As the air is warmer, it will stubbornly and greedily suck water from the soil and from the plants. So if you're a plant, you can imagine how this is like a tricky thing to handle. So plants and conifer needles that we're looking at, they have these small pores at their surface. They're called stomata. These pores allow them to consume the carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. These pores let the water escape. And the plants are continuously managing that trade-off between how much carbon dioxide they consume and how much water they can let escape. So you can imagine how tricky it is when trees are growing in the southwest, where moisture is already scarce and it's depleted when it gets warmer in June. Because if they open their pores to consume CO2, that risk of losing water becomes higher and higher as the atmosphere or the air getting warmer and drier. So what they do, like I showed you in that previous photograph, they start closing their stomates to not lose water because they cannot afford to lose water. It's already scarce. So this quantity is very interesting to track down because it gives us an overview how tree functioning is responding to that stress. First when they start growing, throughout their dry period, and then when the monsoon kicks in. And you can see that this VPD, or the atmospheric water demand, throughout the season is very tied to the monsoon as well. So this is the precipitation throughout the season. This is when the monsoon arrives. You can see clearly the pulse of the monsoon. When we look at the atmospheric water demands, you can see that the demand increases until June, and then when the monsoon arrives, the water demand goes down. So there is less pressure on the trees. And it becomes interesting to look at how this is recorded in the tree, because it can give us clues about how trees are relying in terms of growth on the available moisture, not only in the soil, but also in the atmosphere. So the way we do this in the lab with a number of my colleagues, we look at something different than only the ring width. We track almost real-time changes in the growth of the trees by subdividing 1 year into several pieces. We do 5 pieces on each ring. We know that this time marker, this dark band, is June. This is when it's the driest. So we know that when they started growing, usually end of March, early April. I bet it's going to be a little bit earlier this year because of the wet winter we had, if things don't change. And we can look from April to June what happened by slicing this part into 2 pieces. And then we can also take the piece during that dry period and really see how trees dealt with that stress. And then we can take the piece that corresponds to the monsoon. First, this is mostly July and August, and the darker part will be September and October. We do so by collecting these samples from multiple ports in the Sky Island. Our network has 4 sites, so we have Catalinas, Piñaleno, Gila, and the Sacramento. And the idea in this project is to look how different the trees, throughout this gradient. When you start with the monsoon here, and it looks quite differently from New Mexico, how the trees are responding to this different timing of the monsoon. So we're able to track this variation almost at a bi-weekly resolution. So this is really looking at the seasonal details recorded within the ring. So we take 6 cores we sample 6 trees from each site. We studied 30 years, and we do 5 sections in each year. And we don't look at the ring width, we look at the chemical fingerprint recorded in the wood. This is mainly carbon and oxygen. And we know that the carbon and oxygen that is locked in the wood is tightly related to the moisture condition in the atmosphere and in the soil. And by tracking it at almost biweekly resolution, we can then know how trees functioning with their physiology responded to that. And this graphic will summarize this major publication that we had in my lab, describing particularly the site in the Catalinas mountain. So you have a tree represented here with the roots, and the trees, when they start growing by the end of March or early April, they have access to soil moisture accumulated during the winter. This green line is representing their growth. But what happens while they have access to the winter moisture, the stress represented by the atmospheric water demand is the highest during this period. So the trees, while they have their feet in the water during the winter, they experience most of the stress throughout the period leading to the hyper-arid June. And this is the period where trees, specifically during June, start closing their stomates to minimize how much water they lose. And then the monsoon happens, and the atmospheric water demand is reduced. And you can see that their growth experiences least stress compared to the winter. So it's almost counterintuitive. You think that soil moisture available from the winter will lead to most growth. This is where they experience most of the stress. While the monsoon brings this relief because the atmosphere is humid, so then the trees, they can open their pores and consume more CO2, carbon dioxide, to photosynthesize. You can see that towards the end of the growing season, around the end of September and October, the atmospheric water demand goes up a little bit, and then they will experience more stress. So the modulating role of the monsoon is beyond bringing just a pulse of moisture. What it does, it mediates or it alleviates that atmospheric water demand that exerts so much pressure on the trees. So imagine these trees high up in the mountain. They have been growing this particular seasonality that they experience. During June, you can imagine that they are holding their breath for a second or two by slowing down, waiting for the monsoon to arrive. And then they do a lot of growth once the monsoon is here. But as the research is showing that the monsoon will either be drier or be later, imagine if you have to hold your breath for more than a second or two, or maybe for 3, 4, 5, 10 seconds. And the question becomes what do they do when the monsoon arrives? Are they gonna resume their growth? Or are they gonna be just done by that time, because it's hard to resume your growth after that? And that's one of the major challenges actually when we try to project tree mortality, is understanding when it's happening. And these informations that we gain from the chemical fingerprints can teach us and help us actually to do numerical simulation of how the trees, in the face of climate change, under a drier monsoon or later monsoon, will respond or not. So, VPD sucks. And the monsoon is a very, very important part of this ecosystem, because beyond the water, it makes the atmosphere more humid, and literally you can think about it, trees do breathe more easily when the monsoon is here. With that, this is what I have for you. I'll be